I want to talk to you today about a story that flashed across your screen and then disappeared, leaving behind more heat than light. You probably saw some version of it go by. Donald Trump musing about tapping Canadian water to slake the American West, and Mark Carney, the former central banker turned would-be prime minister, swatting the idea away with the brisk assurance that Canada's water is not up for sale. The news cycle treated it as one more trans-border spat, another episode in the increasingly familiar drama of Trump versus whoever stands on the other side of a podium. But if you stop at that level, you miss almost everything that actually matters. What you really saw was a preview of politics in an age when we are colliding, quite literally, with the limits of nature. You saw a wealthy, powerful country inching toward the point where it begins to treat fresh water the way previous generations treated oil and gas. You saw a smaller but resource-rich neighbor signaling that it understands the stakes and does not intend to drift casually into a new era of liquid geopolitics. And you saw how a political culture that has long spoken the language of free trade, continental partnership, and open markets is suddenly uneasily rediscovering the older language of sovereignty, control, and national interest. If you live in the United States or Canada, or for that matter anywhere that depends on predictable weather and reliable taps, this is not an exotic dispute. It reaches into your lawn, your grocery bill, your electric grid, and eventually your ballot. On the surface, the event itself was simple enough. Trump talking about drought and the declining reservoirs of the American West suggested that the United States should look north toward what he described as the great unused abundance of Canadian water. In his telling, there are vast lakes, thick snowpacks, swollen rivers, all politely sitting just beyond the 49th parallel. While American farmers struggle, cities ration, and the great engineered marvels of the 20th century, Colorado River dams, interstate aqueducts, sprawling irrigation network, strain under 21st century stress. Why not, he asked, in essence, treat that northern water as one more item in the continental exchange of goods and capital, no different in kind from lumber, oil, or automobiles moving back and forth across the border? That framing was not accidental. It presents the issue as one of fairness, reciprocity, and common sense. The United States has a water problem. Canada has water. Modern economies are built on deals. So why not make one more deal? Carney's answer, standing on the Canadian side of the conversation, was equally simple on its face and rather more revealing underneath. He said, in effect, that bulk water exports are off the table. Not for the next quarter, not until the polls improve, but as a matter of principle, rooted in how Canada conceives of this resource. He allowed the usual political wiggle room. No responsible politician ever says never in quite absolute terms. But the message was unmistakable. There will be no gigantic tap turned on at the border, no continent-spanning water pipeline, no conversion of Canadian lakes into a strategic reserve for American agrus and desert suburbs. That refusal is easy to cast as national pride or anti-Trump posturing, and no doubt there is a measure of both involved. But if you stop there, you miss the deeper story. The deeper story is that water is forcing us to admit what we preferred not to see about our economic model, our climate trajectory, and our institutions. For most of the modern era, both countries treated water as a background condition, like gravity or daylight. It was just there. In Canada, that attitude was bolstered by geography. A vast territory, a relatively small population, and nearly a fifth of the world's fresh water supply meant that scarcity felt almost theoretical. In the United States, by contrast, water was abundant in some places and scarce in others. But the national instinct was to engineer around that fact. We built dams and canals and aqueducts, and in doing so, encouraged cities and farms to grow where the climate itself had not invited them. The West, as you know it from movies and postcards, and perhaps your own commute, is not a naturally occurring settlement pattern. It is a civil engineering project, sustained by a quiet assumption that the rivers would keep flowing, the snow and the Rockies would keep falling, and the aquifers beneath the fields would refill themselves out of sight and out of mind. That assumption is now being tested. And you feel it, whether you follow politics closely or not. You feel it in rising water bills, and in the increasingly familiar spectacle of once-in-a-century droughts arriving every decade. You feel it every time a wildfire season seems to begin earlier and end later. And officials tell you that parched landscapes are part of the reason. When Trump talks about Canadian water, he is not inventing a problem. He is articulating in his own improvised way a pressure that has been building quietly for years inside American policy circles and corporate boardrooms. For a long time, a certain class of strategist has dreamed of transnational water transfers, of continental-scale infrastructure that would move northern waters south the way pipelines have long moved oil and gas. Some models have been sketched, some feasibility studies whispered about. Some investors have no doubt done the arithmetic on what it would mean to turn water into a cross-per commodity. Carney's swift rejection was therefore not just a personal disagreement with Trump. It was a line drawn against that whole way of thinking. A way of thinking that treats water as one more tradable input, rather than as the precondition for any civilized life at all. And here is where I want you to pay close attention, because the institutional stakes live beneath the rhetoric. The moment a country like Canada agrees to export water on a large scale, it invites not only the flow of liquid, but the flow of law. It entangles itself in trade agreements, dispute resolution mechanisms, and investor rights regimes that have a stubborn habit of outliving the governments that signed them. Once water is classified as a commodity in that sense, decisions about how much to export, to whom, and on what terms are no longer solely domestic choices. They become subject to arguments about discrimination, expropriation, and market access. In other words, they migrate from the realm of democratic deliberation into the narrower channels of trade arbitration and contract law. Carney, as a veteran of central banking and global finance, understands that terrain. He knows that what looks like a pragmatic concession today can harden into a binding constraint tomorrow, one that future Canadian governments might struggle to undo, even if the climate, the public, or simple prudence demanded it. That is why his answer was so blunt, and why this apparently brief exchange between two very different public figures deserves more of your attention than it received when it first scrolled by. If you look more closely at the United States in this moment, you can see why the idea of importing water surfaces again and again, even if political leaders pretend it is merely hypothetical. The American West was built during an era when climate patterns were unusually favorable. Wet decades, heavy snowpack, predictable melt. Policymakers mistook that anomaly for permanence. They permitted industrial agriculture to expand across deserts that were never meant to host such thirsty crops. They allowed sprawling suburbs to take shape on land whose natural water budget could not begin to support the lawns, pools, fountains, and golf courses that soon defined the region's visual identity. And because the economic returns were high in the short term, no one wanted to confront the long-term arithmetic. But arithmetic always comes due. The Colorado River, once mythically abundant, is now oversubscribed, claimed on paper in volumes far exceeding what climate reality can deliver. Aquifers that took millennia to form have been pumped down in a single generation. This is not a temporary disruption that can be fixed with a rainy winter or two. It is a structural mismatch between the water supply nature provides and the consumption patterns capitalism demands. When a system is built on imbalance, that imbalance eventually manifests as crisis. And crisis, in a political culture wired for growth rather than restraint, produces a predictable reflex. look outward for new inputs rather than inward for new limits. That outward gaze inevitably lands on Canada, whose blue abundance stands in sharp relief to the American Southwest's continuous red warning zone. But if the United States is driven by the search for new supply, Canada is shaped by a very different imperative: the maintenance of sovereignty over essential resources. Canadians have long understood that water is not merely a commodity. It is an anchor of national identity, an ecological inheritance, and increasingly a geopolitical asset. When outsiders look north and see surplus, Canadians look inward and see a delicate balance of ecosystems, communities, and treaty obligations. These divergent worldviews mean that the conversation was destined to become fraught the moment it was spoken aloud. And this is where the deeper structures of capitalism and climate collide with the quieter but equally powerful structures of law. Water, unlike oil, does not regenerate on a geological schedule. It regenerates on a climatic schedule. And that schedule is being scrambled by rising temperatures. Warmer air pulls more moisture from soil and vegetation. Snowpacks shrink because precipitation falls as rain instead of snow. Rivers flood violently in one season and vanish in the next. In that volatility, corporations do not see a signal to reduce consumption. They see a signal that control over reliable water will become newly profitable. This is why the loudest advocates of cross-border water transfers are rarely the communities actually struggling to survive drought. They are agrigos conglomerates, real estate empires, and investment groups whose profits depend on maintaining the illusion of stability even as the climate destabilizes beneath them. These actors frame their proposals in humanitarian terms, but their spreadsheets tell a different story. They know that infrastructure on the scale required to move water from northern Canada to southern California would generate decades of guaranteed revenue streams backed by treaties and trade agreements that shield investors from political shifts. From their perspective, scarcity is not a tragedy. It is a business model. And here is the uncomfortable truth. If Canada were to open the door even slightly to bulk water exports, the pressure from these interests would not ebb over time. It would intensify. Contracts would be written, markets would form, pipeline routes would be surveyed. And once billions of dollars flowed into such a system, the political system would begin to revolve around protecting those flows. What began as a negotiated agreement between governments would become a continental infrastructure regime owned and operated largely by private entities. In that world, Canadians would not simply be sharing water. They would be surrendering long-term governing authority over it, because the legal architecture of free trade often treats corporate expectations as more saccharine than democratic decisions. But the story grows more complex still. The United States is not a single actor with a unified need. It is a layered political organism in which states, industries, cities, lobbyists, and federal agencies all have different water anxieties and different appetites for external solutions. Arizona worries about keeping farming alive in the desert. California worries about feeding its almond, dairy, and export industries. Nevada worries about the sustainability of its resort economy. Private equity firms worry about capturing the next frontier of infrastructure investment. And national politicians worry that if they cannot keep water flowing, they will be remembered not for their slogans, but for the day the taps ran dry. When that many powerful actors converge around the idea of importing water, the idea gains momentum even if the engineering, environmental, and political obstacles remain immense. That momentum positions Canada not as a partner in friendly negotiation, but as a pressure point in the American political imagination. Canada becomes the place where a solution exists. If only politics could be made to yield. That subtle shift is how entitlement creeps into rhetoric. Cooperation begins to sound like obligation. Dialogue begins to sound like expectation. A resource owned by another sovereign nation begins to be spoken about as though it were simply waiting to be claimed by the logic of need. Canadians hear this tone instantly. They have heard it before in earlier eras of continental resource extraction. And it is precisely why Carney chose to shut the door so quickly. Because once the conversation grows normalized, the pressure never recedes. Yet refusing is not a permanent shield, because the climate itself keeps reshaping the political context. The American West will continue to dry for decades. Snowpacks will continue shrinking, and a society built on 20th century hydro-optimism will continue to confront 21st century hydrological limits. If domestic conservation is politically difficult, if agricultural restructuring threatens corporate interests, and if cities resist curbing growth, the temptation to seek external sources will only intensify. Meanwhile, Canada will face its own contradictions. It wants to protect water as a national trust, but it also knows that scarcity elsewhere enhances its bargaining power. It wants to appear principled, but it also wants strategic advantage in a future where water-rich nations wield influence analogous to oil exporters in the last century. So even as Canada positions itself as a guardian of ecological integrity, it cannot entirely escape the geopolitical logic that scarcity produces. Nations do not hoard resources only out of virtue. They hoard them because scarcity transforms resources into leverage. This is why the present tension is not just about today's droughts, but about tomorrow's world order. As climate change accelerates, fresh water will no longer be a quiet background condition. It will define politics, shape alliances, and ignite disputes in ways that will feel both familiar and startlingly new. And unless we understand the economic systems that have brought us here and the political instincts they trigger, we will mistake these tensions for isolated controversies instead of early signals of a new planetary reality. To understand where this all leads, you have to recognize that water scarcity does not simply create environmental stress. It rearranges political priorities, redraws economic incentives, and exposes the fragilities of systems we once assumed were permanent. In the United States, the pressure to maintain growth without fundamentally changing consumption patterns is immense. Entire industries have been built on the illusion that water can always be moved, borrowed, pumped, or purchased from somewhere else. That illusion shaped the settlement of the West, the rise of irrigated megafarms, and the explosive expansion of desert cities whose glittering skylines depend on rivers that can no longer support the weight placed upon them. As reality closes in, political leaders will face a choice they have spent decades avoiding: confront the structural causes of the crisis, or search for external solutions that postpone the reckoning. And because crises rarely produce introspection in powerful nations, the search for external solutions will persist. That is why, even after Carney's firm pushback, the idea of accessing Canadian water will keep resurfacing. It will reappear in think tank white papers, in the quiet ambitions of infrastructure investors, in drought-stricken state legislatures, and eventually in the rhetoric of whoever seeks to frame themselves as the next savior of the American West. When a superpower feels its limits for the first time in a century, its imagination turns outward before it turns inward. Canada, for its part, will try to maintain a principled position, but it will be navigating a world where principles alone do not protect nations from pressure. As water becomes a strategic asset, Canada will face rising expectations from allies, from trading partners, from multinational corporations, and even from its own provinces whose political calculus may differ from Ottawa's. The country will also feel the internal strains that scarcity elsewhere tends to magnify. Indigenous nations will rightly insist that water sovereignty cannot be bargained away. Environmental scientists will warn of irreversible ecosystem damage. And ordinary Canadians, witnessing global patterns of depletion, will become even more protective of what they view as a sacred trust. These forces will shape a defensive posture that may harden over time. Not because Canada is selfish, but because history has taught smaller nations that once they open the door to resource extraction by larger powers, the closing of that door rarely remains in their hands. Yet, even as Canada guards its sovereignty, it will also be drawn into a world where water becomes a bargaining chip in climate negotiations, trade partnerships, and diplomatic relationships. No nation, however principled, is immune to the logic of geopolitics when scarcity becomes the global norm. But the heart of this story is not about whether a pipeline will ever be built, or whether future politicians will revisit the idea. The deeper truth is that both countries, and indeed the world, are entering an era in which old assumptions about nature, markets, and governance no longer hold. The economic system we have inherited was built on the premise that nature could be bent endlessly to human will, that resources would expand as demand expanded, and that innovation would always outrun depletion. That system worked for a time because the planet generously absorbed the pressure. But now, the balance has shifted. Climate change is revealing limits that markets cannot outmaneuver and engineering cannot indefinitely override. Water is simply the resource that is forcing the issue first because it is the one we literally cannot replace. The tensions between the United States and Canada are therefore not anomalies. They are previews of the world we are building. A world where nations begin to measure security not by military strength or GDP growth, but by access to stable ecosystems. A world where political conflict becomes entangled with climate physics. A world where the wealthiest actors try to preserve their privileges by acquiring what nature can no longer freely provide. And so, the topic ends not with a definitive resolution, but with a recognition. This moment is a turning point. Trump's comment and Carney's refusal were not simply a clash of personalities or policies. They were early notes in a larger symphony that climate change is composing across the globe. Whether you live in a drought-stricken valley, a city by a shrinking river, or a country blessed with abundant lakes, your life will increasingly be shaped by how societies manage the most basic resource of all. Will nations hoard or share? Will markets commodify, or will publics defend? Will scarcity become an engine of conflict or an impetus for transformation? These questions are no longer speculative. They are beginning to define the century. And long after the headlines have faded, the deeper truth remains. The struggle over water is the struggle over the future itself. And how we respond to that struggle will determine not just the fate of two countries, but the shape of the world we leave to those who come after.